Professor Richard Wolff and Aaron Maté had an interesting discussion about the media. So you guys know I've been talking a lot about censorship. I've covered the Twitter files, I think, pretty extensively with most of the release. I think so. I've covered it pretty extensively. And some people have asked me like, oh man, not Twitter files again. But the reason why I continue to talk about it is because censorship, I think, is so incredibly dangerous. And it's not just about Twitter. It can start with something like Twitter, and then it can spread to a state like Texas where they are making laws against people trying to get an abortion through the internet. I'm going to talk about that on Thursday. Censorship can spread. Mainstream media doesn't endure the same type of censorship that we do in independent media. There's things they can talk about that I can't talk about on here. It's just the reality of the situation. But they also take cues from the State Department, which is also problematic. But it's a big issue. And it all goes back to the media. And so Professor Richard Wolff here, that's where he starts off this conversation right out of the gate. Let's talk about the problems with the media. Let's get into it.
All right. You're a critic of U.S. mass media, and I would like to sort of pick your brain, if I could, to tell us, to start with, what are the dominant themes of the mass media as you see them now that represent what you're focusing on, your critique of? And I wanted to start with the place of the U.S. in the world today. How would you characterize for us mass media treatment and what's wrong with it?
If you look at how the role of the U.S. in the world is covered in U.S. establishment media, I think a fundamental problem is that it's presumed that we have the right to be the rulers and we have the right to tell other governments what to do, that we have the right to impose sanctions that are designed to cripple entire economies and make people.
Speaking of sanctions, what were we just talking about?
People suffer, and our motives in doing so aren't questioned. So we talk about wanting to spread democracy around the world, and I think it's taken for granted, if you read establishment media accounts, that not only do we have the right to do all these policies, but that our motives are pure. And I just don't accept that as a journalist. As a journalist, we're supposed to be skeptical of power, especially power within our own societies, because that's the power that we're responsible for. And I don't see U.S. media doing that.
This speaks to the issue we were just talking about with Syria in reference to the sanctions. This is the thing. Like I told you, most people I talk to outside of the space have no idea this is even happening. And then when you explain to them what's going on, it's just like, well, I'm sure the U.S. has their reasons. It's always interesting to me when people say that. Well, I'm sure they have their reasons. What reasons? Other than stealing resources, other than trying to cripple them, having these people starve to death. What other reasons? And for the ones who are tuning in to mainstream media, when they hear about these attacks abroad, most of them will defend the United States government because that's what they were taught to do. And mainstream media still tells them to do that. We're in the right, they're in the wrong. And not once do these people sit back and question, is it a little bit strange that they tell us that the U.S. is always in the right? Am I really supposed to believe that every other country is always the one that's bad? We never do anything wrong? You would think more people would ask that question, but they don't. So the media is a big problem.
Right, good. The next question about the same issue of mass media. The 20th century was full of the story of a great struggle between capitalism and socialism, often characterized as a great struggle between the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union then. Well, the Soviet Union is gone. Here we are again fighting Russia. What is it about the struggle between capitalism and socialism that the mass media keep saying, and what's the problem there?
The U.S. is a hegemonic power. It has hundreds of military bases around the world. As you've covered, its corporations control, a huge proportion of the world's wealth. And so when you're a hegemon, you need enemies constantly to justify your hegemony, your military bases, your interventions, all the money that is spent on war, on weapons of war. And so the Soviet Union played that purpose during the Cold War, and it was also used to justify undermining any alternative to the US-led system. So, for example, even in countries like Vietnam or Nicaragua, where you had governments arising from the will of the population, the U.S. tried to destroy those societies by blaming the Soviet Union as being behind everything. And we're seeing a similar playbook today, that Russia is used as a boogeyman whenever the U.S. wants to try to control a country and destabilize it. And so that's the function that Russia plays in the current U.S. imagination.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that for just a second. I have heard Russia demonized since I was a kid. There was this Rocky movie, I think it was Rocky 4, right? And I like the Rocky series, the earlier movies. The later ones are kind of, But Rocky 4, where Rocky had to face a Russian boxer. By the way, the guy who played, this is a whole totally off topic. The guy who played the boxer, I forget his name. Somebody in the chat will know. The guy who played the boxer in real life, that guy went to MIT. Yeah, he was going to be like a chemist or something like that. Anywho, Rocky had to square off with against a Russian boxer. And the whole theme throughout the movie was just like Russia bad, Russia cold. Even when Rocky went to Russia himself and he was training in Russia, he was training outside. Yes, Dolph Lundgren. He was training outside, and Dolph Lundgren, he was actually training inside like this gym, this high-tech gym. Rocky was training outside, like in the snow and all that kind of stuff. So it was like, even then it's like they were depicting Russia as like this vacant, cold, snowy, fierce place. And I've seen that happen a lot of times in Hollywood. But that was when I was little. I saw those movies and I was just like, they give you these ideas of what Russia is supposed to be like and what the people there are supposed to be like, right? So this goes all the way back, and this happened before I was born as well. So there's always been this idea pushed out from Hollywood in the United States and from the mainstream media that Russia is not a safe space, so to speak. And if you see those images enough, you can believe it. So there's that.
I think it's going to be provocative for many people that the closest we've come to war, and even perhaps nuclear war with Russia, was not when it was a socialist country, whatever exactly that means. It's actually when it became capitalist, like us, that the war began to heat up and become a greater threat. It ought to make people wonder, as you quite rightly put it, what the reality was back then, whether it was we need an enemy or it was a genuine problem with socialism. And what about the militant labor movement? The last couple of years in this country have seen a kind of resurgence, reawakening, whatever you want to call it, of workers fighting for unions, making strikes, and so on. How do you see the mass media coping with, making sense of all of that?
I think there's been a class war going on for decades, as you cover better than anyone else. And I think unions are obviously a very big threat to that. Just recently, there were reports saying that union membership in the U.S. is at record lows, despite the individual gains at some places like Amazon and Starbucks. And I think a mass media that is controlled by the same corporations that have every interest in breaking worker power and keeping unions down has been pretty much on board with that agenda. You have some exceptions. You have some good reporters at corporate outlets that cover workers' issues seriously. But overall, I mean, just look at how much effort is made to propagandize us into being convinced that we need to spend our resources on war, funding billions of dollars for a proxy war in Ukraine. And
I want to chime in here for just a second about the labor movements and mass media. Mass media, they did cover Chris Small's efforts in unionizing the first Amazon warehouse. And I think the reason why they covered it is because it was the very first Amazon, and Amazon's such a huge company. It was the very first Amazon warehouse to actually form a union. So that was a huge story. Obviously, they weren't going to turn that away. But what I have seen since then is some of these other wins that have happened in reference to unionization. Mass media, for the most part, is not covering it. Or if they do cover it, like Fox Business, they'll cover it in a negative way. They'll say things like, do these employees really need to have a union? Don't they already get benefits? I mean, what more could those people want? They'll cover it in that way. I've seen those videos, right? So I think when Aaron talks about the fact that some of the people in mass media are tied to corporate interests, this is incredibly true. Nick pointed this out, I think it was a couple weeks ago, that the gentleman who was on the panel with Nina Turner, I said he looked like Hank from Breaking Bad. Nick pointed out that he has straight, direct corporate ties. You know, you look up some of these commentators that you see on mainstream media, and you can connect them right to like the military industrial complex. Like they have worked for Lockheed Martin, or they're connected to what's the other one? Shoot balls. I forget it. The think tanks. They're connected to the think tanks that are part of the military industrial complex. And then you understand why those people have those seats on those panels on CNN and MSNBC and Fox News. So that is one thing I will say when it comes to mainstream media, regardless if it's CNN or if it's Fox News, they're both corporate conglomerates, and they're both controlled by the military industrial complex and the State Department. So that's important for people to understand. That's why certain people you will never see on there. This is why CNN won't bring certain people on. This is why MSNBC won't bring certain people on, because of those reasons, because they know what you're going to say. They don't want you to come on there and start saying bad things about the military industrial complex. They don't want you to come on there and tell people that BlackRock owns like almost everything in the world. They don't want you to do that. Those are their investors.
One outcome of all these foreign adventures is that the argument is made that we don't have the money to take care of our people at home. So we still don't have health care, even as we're authorizing just endless blank checks for foreign adventures like the current proxy war in Ukraine.
Tell me, where is independent media? You're in the thick of it. You participate. You're part of it. Is it working? Is it reaching an audience? Is it performing the function you yourself have described is its purpose?
I think recent years have been very exciting for independent media. After years of being lied to, I think more and more people are done with establishment media outlets. The Iraq War, which so many major outlets bought into, and we've all know, just no one doubts anymore that that was based on lies. And the media failed to do its job in pushing back on those lies, and in fact became stenographers for those lies. And you can take that to virtually every other war. Russiagate was a major fixation of the US media, where we were told endlessly that Trump was installed by Vladimir Putin and that he was a Russian agent being blackmailed with secret tapes. And that has all collapsed as well. And eventually, after so many humiliations and failures, people start to get fed up. And I think in recent years, we've seen an explosion in independent voices and people craving perspectives that are outside of the constraints of the establishment. And so I think it's a very good time to be in independent media, and I'm very happy to be a part of it.
That's right. And I think that we need more people, like more voices in independent media. You know, I know it can be somewhat competitive, which is really, that's still weird to me, but it can be somewhat competitive. Some people don't want to share time slots with people. It's just weird shit. Like no one owns a time slot, like things like that. Like it can have those issues with it. But I think that the more voices, the better, because the more people, then the more voices, the more people, the more voices, and the more people that you'll be able to reach. And I think that, yes, we do have to deal with the suppression that's on YouTube. That's just a given. It is what it is. People are more heavily suppressed now than they were 3-4 years ago on YouTube and independent media. But I will say that I hope that you learn something from me. Like I know when I watch independent media, I was learning things. I was learning things that mainstream media was not telling me. And that was very appealing to me. So I hope that when you watch me, I hope you're learning things as well, because I agree. I think that more people are kind of turning away from mainstream media in a sense, not as much as I would like, but I do think some of them are, because at least the numbers show that. In reference to CNN, like their ratings are steadily declining, even though they've made some different management decisions. The ratings are still a problem with CNN. So it is what it is. But I think that says something. I think more people are starting to question the mainstream media narrative, and that's how they find people like us, right?
I would say the same thing for us. We are amazed at our growth. We've been here now for 10 years, and we never dreamed we'd have the size of audience that we now have, our ability to function and to grow. It's extraordinary. I kind of pinch myself a little bit every so often to make sure that this isn't a fantasy of mine. What about the reaction of the corporate media? What about the reaction of the mainstream? They must be seeing this too. Do you have a sense? Do you experience an effort to silence, to marginalize, to exclude the kind of media you're talking about?
I think there's an effort to basically pretend that independent voices who don't drink the Kool-Aid just don't exist. And I experienced this throughout Russiagate, where you had this dynamic where every single day you'd have some new development, and that would lead the establishment media to declare that Trump is finished. They're going to find the smoking gun of collusion. And I took the trouble of actually reading the available evidence and showing that what was there was not what was being claimed. And throughout that period, I was just ignored. I was insulted by, some people in the establishment media, but my claims were never actually weighed, and there was never any attempt at serious intellectual debate, which is what should happen in any minimally honest journalistic culture. You have people with different perspectives and you have a debate. Well, when someone dissents from the prevailing orthodoxy, the answer is to ignore them, to try to censor them, or to dismiss them. In the case of, covering the issue of Russia critically, that gets you dismissed as being an agent of Vladimir Putin or something like that. But I think most people who aren't, card-carrying McCarthyites can see through that.
Tell me.
Even calling for peace, even people that call for peace now, they smear us. They call us like those types of names. It's really weird. Like some people are so brainwashed, man. Oh man.
Do you think it's a reasonable parallel the way that the Ukraine issue is being covered now?
Do I think it's an interesting parallel in terms of voices being silenced?
Yes, and in terms of your experience with Russiagate and the work is there another Aaron Maté probably working in the wings somewhere around this Ukraine issue who is going to replicate kind of what happened to you?
Well, I mean, I'm trying to replicate what happened to me because I'm also trying with Russiagate, because I'm also trying to offer factual coverage of the Ukraine proxy war, which I think is the most dangerous issue in the world. And I think it's actually the outgrowth of the very dynamics of Russiagate, because part of the problem with Russiagate, as I was warning about pretty tirelessly for a long time, is that it was normalizing this culture inside liberal politics in the US that we should be stoking war with Russia, that we should be looking down on diplomacy with Russia, that in accusing Russia of brainwashing millions of Americans into voting for into voting for Donald Trump and not voting for Hillary, that was pushing an agenda that treats Russia as this nefarious power that we can't negotiate with. And that's very dangerous when you're talking about the world's other top nuclear power. And so I think you can draw a direct line between Russiagate and the Ukraine war. And I've been trying to point out some of the many facts that get overlooked in discussions of the Ukraine war. The fact that the war, as horrible as it is, it didn't begin when Russia invaded. There's been a war going on in Ukraine since 2014, when there was a US-backed coup that overthrew the government of Viktor Yanukovych. And that set off a civil war inside Ukraine in which rebels backed by Russia rose up against the new coup government. And the coup government was backed by the US. And rather than pursuing peace and respecting a peace deal that was reached in 2015 under something called the Minsk Accords, the U.S. has basically sided with Ukraine's far right in undermining peace and undermining any prospect of peace inside Ukraine. And I think put us on this path. And that coincides with a U.S. record of trying to bring Ukraine into NATO, which U.S. officials have long warned internally would be a very dangerous step. And also building up advanced weaponry on Russia's borders. So, for example, tearing up arms control treaties so that the U.S. can install missile sites in Poland and Romania. And all these issues are in the background of Russia's war in Ukraine, and they're just not discussed. And by not discussing them, we foreclose any possibility of diplomacy, because for diplomacy to happen, these issues have to be addressed.
Yeah. Well said. I mean, this is one of the things we've discussed multiple times on the show is there's no profit in peace. The profit is in war, economic profit. And that's a big part of the problem. Even if that means that you're going to destroy another country, like the US government doesn't care. There's over 700 bases, US bases in the world. Why? I think we're going to finish up here.
It's almost as though you have in Washington people with what the French would call an idée fixe, a fixed idea of how the world works, and they're going to pursue their aggressive agenda without any regard for the fact that the world is changing all the time. And if you ignore all of that, you're going to be running a policy that takes you right into a stone wall. I watched the competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China with a mentality, whether the Trump administration's trade wars and tariff wars or the Biden administration's basically continuing it for lack of a knowledge of what to do. It never works. The gap between Russia and China, between China and the United States keeps narrowing. The Chinese outmaneuver us at every turn. The question isn't asked what's going on. It's a continual kind of hostility. If we keep the Seventh Fleet in the South China Sea, somehow we're going to fix all of this. It's bizarre. I wish we had much more time. I have more questions for you.
Yeah, they because these interviews are usually only like 15 to 20 minutes. But if you do want to see the full video, because this is part 2 of that episode, part 1 actually talks about like how did they oh, I see what they did. Anywho, part 1 of the episode is when he goes over more like the economic update that he usually does, but it's called Economic Update, Establishment Media in Russia with Aaron Maté. So that is actually, I believe it's the most recent video. So if you haven't had a chance to check out the full video, definitely check that out.